The US Supreme Court declined on Monday to hear a bid by President Joe Biden's administration to enforce in Texas federal guidance requiring hospitals to perform abortions if needed to stabilize a patient's emergency medical condition. The Supreme Court justices turned away the appeal of a lower court's decision that halted enforcement of the guidance in Texas, where a Republican-backed near total ban on abortion is in effect, and against two members of two anti-abortion medical associations. We're looking at how the Supreme Court's influence could be affected on issues regarding the election. The Supreme Court, of course, has a political bias towards the Republicans, but justice isn't supposed to be political, is it? It's supposed to be above the law. I can hear you all shout, and I applaud you for doing so. The fact is, though, there is this built-in Republican majority because Donald Trump was able to appoint 3 justices to the court. Monte takes up the story.
You have to go way back to the year 2000 when the Supreme Court stepped in to stop the recounting of votes in Florida, effectively handing the presidency to George W. Bush over his opponent Al Gore, to find a time when the court played such a big part in presidential politics. The present court has a 6-3 conservative majority. With 3 justices nominated by Donald Trump, the court has issued a series of rulings that have reshaped the country.
It is not a secret that President Trump picked a third of the current Supreme Court, and that has made a big difference, and it has really angered progressives and Democrats.
But it's not just Democrats who disapprove. Opinion polls show the court is overwhelmingly out of step with the American public in general. Its approval rating at a near historic low, with just 43% of Americans in support of the job it's doing.
Our body! Our body!
That distaste for the court extends to some of its key rulings, including the decision in 2022 overturning Roe v. Wade and a federal right to an abortion, a ruling a vast majority of Americans disapprove of. Since that decision, abortion has become illegal or restricted in more than 20 states. More recently, in Trump versus the United States, the court ruled that the president has wide-ranging immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts, which could even include executing your political enemies. Dissenting Justice Sonia Sotomayor said the decision was a mockery and transformed a president into a king above the law.
Always act appropriately.
At least 2 of the justices have been under scrutiny for their behavior, and none more than Clarence Thomas. He refused to recuse himself from the immunity case involving former President Trump, in spite of repeated efforts by his wife to lobby officials to overturn the results of the 2020 election, which Trump lost to Joe Biden. Thomas also accepted millions of dollars in gifts over 2 decades on the bench, most of which he didn't initially report until media reports surfaced. Justice Samuel Alito has faced criticism after photos surfaced of an upside-down American flag flying outside his home, a symbol associated with Trump's Stop the Steal movement, and a second flag associated with January 6th outside his vacation home. Late last year, the court announced it would subject itself to a new code of ethics, but the rules are non-binding, a sign the justices are intent on policing themselves.
Justice is supposed to be independent and kind of separate of politics. That's what I've always been taught. Let's bring in Fraser Jackson. Fraser, of course, our correspondent watching all developments for us in Washington. Fraser, I'm fascinated here. What happens if the US Supreme Court has to make some kind of ruling about who wins the upcoming election? What happens? What happens? Tell us.
Well, the Supreme Court was starting its first day today with about 40 cases on its docket. Some analysts saying that's a rather light load, so they're clearly anticipating having to weigh in later down the line. The Supreme Court so far has been somewhat reticent to do so, but of course they have done on 2 occasions. They allowed Donald Trump to remain on the ballot during the primaries in places like Colorado, and they also did that immunity ruling, which said that a president had immunity for official acts undertaken during their time in office. Well, they now could also face some more action, both before and after the election. Before, they could get involved in disputes over ballot access measures, for example, or also vote counting rules. There's also something that could come into play after the election, a couple of different scenarios, but a lot of them are centering around these key swing states which will decide the election. In Pennsylvania, for example, there's a dispute over mail-in ballots and what will disqualify a mail-in ballot, whether that's somebody failing to put their social security number on it or simply even putting the wrong date on their mail-in ballot. All of those could disqualify those mail-in ballots. And that is important because, of course, the mail-in ballots normally favor Democrats. Democrats tend to vote early and vote by mail, and the in-person on-the-day vote tends to skew more Republican. So that is something that we are watching closely, which at the moment is still in the state's courts, but could land at SCOTUS's front door. We're also looking at things coming out of Georgia as well. The election board in that county, in that state, is certainly Trump-friendly, and they've also come up with some questionable actions, which even some of the Republicans in the state are questioning. And some of the state's governor, for example, said that they could have gone too far. So that those actions on whether they allow a hand count of the ballot on election day is also something that SCOTUS will be looking at. And then ultimately, the main thing really is whether we're going to see a replay of the year 2000 and that Florida recount between Al Gore and George Bush, which effectively the stopping of that counting handed the election to George Bush, and has been one of the most consequential and arguably controversial rulings by the Supreme Court in recent U.S. history. So a lot of sway that the U.S. Supreme Court could still have here, but the justices ultimately likely hoping that they can kind of stay out of this one and will see the election play out normally.
It's interesting and disturbing. Fraser, thank you very much indeed for bringing your ray of sunshine onto that story, which could turn out to be quite bleak, because one always believed that justice was beyond the political realm. But there we go. It seems in the US there is a grey area between the two. We will continue to bring you all aspects of the US presidential election as it develops. Vote day, of course, November the 5th. That's it from me. Short break.